So we'll now open it up for lots of questions.
One question I get when I tell people about Fatima is, well, actually it's two. One is Portugal will now lose the faith. They say Portugal is just as crazy as the rest of the world. And the other one is why Russia, the United States, USA is usury, sodomy, and abortion spread throughout the world. So why is she picking on Russia when actually the United States has spread a lot more garbage?
For the first one, Our Lady said in Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, and then comes out, etc. The first thing to realize is that doesn't mean, certainly, that every Portuguese person is going to preserve the faith. If we point to a community of 5 Portuguese living in Portugal who have preserved the dogmas of the faith, then her statement is true, right? In Portugal, the dogma of the faith will be preserved, will always be preserved. So she never said the entire country, and I think that's the misunderstanding of the prophecy, because you're right. Like the rest of Europe, Portugal is by and large lost the faith. You know, the hierarchy, I mean, it's bad over there. On the flip side, though, just so that, I mean, when you go to Portugal, it is interesting because the people still have a very strong Marian piety. I mean, you start talking about Fatima, you start talking about Our Lady, and you see a more receptive spirit, I think, in Portugal than I do in many other places. I think that's a grace that she's working at. The other thing, by the way, to keep in mind, so it doesn't mean the whole country, even if there's just some, it will be preserved, and that's enough. Back to the 10 of like Abraham. The other thing that's very interesting is that we actually don't know how that statement finishes. It could be a conditional prophecy. It could be that Our Lady said, in Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved if the bishops teach the faith correctly. If the bishops don't change the Mass. If something, you know, a conditional statement. It could very well have been that. And that's where the etc. begins. We just don't know. And so I think it's, you know, that's where we overstep ourselves. We don't know what Our Lady said. It could be a conditional prophecy. There are other conditional prophecies in Fatima. So that's how I answer that. You know, above all, I'm not going to doubt Our Lady. So do I fully know what that means? No, but there's a lot of other possibilities which obviously still retain the truth to her message. As far as why she picked Russia, that really is, it's a lengthy conversation. I can't say we know for certain because you don't always know God's will. But I think we have a lot of clues and a lot of reasons to think that. And the other thing to realize too is it's not picking on Russia. Remember that Russia has been selected by God, chosen. Ultimately, that's what consecration means. Consecration means setting something apart for a holy purpose. So it's not actually like picking on, it's actually elevating Russia. I mean, the Russian people should be very happy that God has selected them for this. Because remember, what's going to happen is Russia's going to convert after she's consecrated, and it's actually through that conversion of Russia the great graces are going to be distributed throughout the world. So they've actually been singled out for a very special role in God's plan. Okay? But at the same time, the way God often works is there's a flip side to that. So if we don't get this done, if we don't get Russia consecrated, then God will use Russia as an instrument of chastisement upon the world. And that's what's happened. The errors of Russia have spread throughout the world. That was part of the prophecy in that second secret. If not, Russia will spread her errors throughout the world. And we could give a long talk on the errors of Russia, because there are many. They are not just communism. There's much more. All these things that you mentioned that the U.S. is suffering from, you said usury, sodomy, abortion. Those things actually are errors of Russia. For example, abortion. Russia's the first country that legalized abortion way back right after Our Lady appeared at Fatima. The destruction of the family. Radical feminism, all of these things are errors of Russia that Russia has promoted. So those errors have spread. That's true. That's happened. And the oldest error of Russia, because Our Lady again is precise. Sometimes people, especially if we lived in the 20th century, we hear errors of Russia and we might think errors of Bolshevism, errors of Karl Marx, errors of communism. And I think some people interpret her words that way. That's not what Our Lady said. Our Lady could have said errors of communism or errors of Bolshevism or errors of socialism. She said errors of Russia. So you should ask yourself, well, why? So the natural question is, well, what is Russia's oldest error? Which is not the U.S.'s oldest error. Russia's oldest error is a rejection of the papacy. So the church split in 1054 between East and West. But the East had been splitting for centuries. If you study the history of the church, the East was always going heretical, and the Pope would call them back. They'd get a good emperor, they'd get a good patriarch, they'd come back. So the East has a history of leaving and come back, leaving and coming back. And even after 1054, they came back. At the Council of Florence, they came back. At the Council of Lyons, they came back. That's in the 1200s and the 1400s. So they keep coming back, and they're going to come back. What's interesting is Russia becomes Catholic right before the split, and they come in under the East. And so when the East split, Constantinople, Russia split with them. And when the East came back, like before the fall of Constantinople, and they signed the documents and they agreed on papal supremacy, that they would be under the Pope, it didn't last because of the Muslim wars, but they agreed and they signed, and they made the dogma of the faith. But when they did, the East, Constantinople and the others, the Russian patriarch stood up and said, no, we won't. Russia is a third Rome, and we're just as important. And so that's why it's a particularly error of Russia that they split off in the church. And today, the greatest part of Orthodoxy, here I'm talking about Eastern Orthodoxy, that group of Catholics that is in schism are Russian Orthodox. Russian Orthodox is the single greatest group of schismatic Catholics right now. So I think Our Lady picked Russia to show it was their error. They have to repent. They have to make reparation for that error. And they're going to get called back. Okay? When Our Lady triumphs and there's peace in the world, the East and the West have to be reunited. You cannot have peace in the world and have the church split and have all this schismatic. So they're coming back. That's why Russia has to be converted to the true faith. There's even more reasons for Russia, but that's the bottom line. There's more, but I hope that helps people understand why we're talking about the errors of Russia and how God's got the perfect solution to fix the problem. And the problem is a rejection of the papacy, and Fatima is all about the Pope. And the Pope asserting who he truly is, the vicar of Christ, who has all the authority of God over temporal affairs and church affairs. Our popes of today have forgotten that. They don't realize they're in charge of temporal affairs, and many of us don't, because it's a great American lie that you have to separate church and state. That is not of God, that's of the devil. Church and state have to be united under God. And Christ is king of both, and the Pope is his vicar. And so the Pope has authority in the state and in the church. And when the Pope says, I'm going to consecrate Russia, he shows that he has authority over Russia. Because you can only consecrate what you have authority over. When did she say Russia needs to be consecrated now? June 13th, 1929. Why is that significant? Because if you know your history, you remember the Great Revolution that the French Revolution unleashed was taking away everything from the church. And the Pope was still a temporal ruler in what's called the Papal States. And then there was an Italian revolution, godless, that took away everything from the Pope. In 1870, he lost it all. And the Pope was a prisoner in the Vatican. So Pope Pius IX, Pope Leo XIII, Pope Pius X, Benedict XV, they're all prisoners there. But they kept saying, what you've done is wrong. They're telling the world and they're telling Italy, you took this land incorrectly. The rightful ruler is the Pope. You can't take this land away. It was called the Great Vatican, the Great Papal Question. And then Pius XI, with Mussolini, signed what's called the Lateran Treaty. And he said, I cede my authority. I will no longer be the temporal authority. He signed it away in a treaty. For certain privileges that the church got that, people go back on anyway, but he should never have done that. He should never have said, I'm not the legitimate authority. Interestingly, they signed that treaty on February 11th, 1929. Feast of Our Lady of Lourdes. And the treaty said it will take effect on June 7th, 1929. And so precisely 1 week after June 7th, when the Pope has ceded his temporal authority, Our Lady comes back and says, now is the time for the Pope to consecrate Russia. He's just ceded his temporal authority. He needs to reclaim it. And by consecrating Russia, he will be showing he has temporal authority over Russia. And by then also the Russian communism was destroying things and killing many Catholics, and it was bad. It had gotten bad. You could tell it was bad. The Pope should have known it was bad. So again, God's got this great, he's working there. In all his actions, he's there. Helps to study our history and know some of these dates. So why Russia? Just a partial answer. There's more.
Just to follow up on that last question, in support of what you just explained, is that Bella Dodd was that communist who when she converted, she revealed that in the 30s, that was exactly when the communists in America got orders that there's so few of you, what we want you to do is get into the seminaries and start corrupting the church from within without removing its structures. And she herself said over 1,000 young men she guided into the seminaries to become in teaching orders and all of that. So Russia has spread her errors largely through bringing down the church in America, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
all that's
so-
exactly right.
I'd just like to ask two things. About the miraculous medal, you mentioned that some of the rings, there was nothing coming from them. As I remember, there was light coming from all the rings, but some were shorter, So it's not that Our Lady, if you don't ask, I'm not giving. It's that she can't, in the economy of the mystical body, she's giving, as much as she can, but some of that depends on our prayers, right? So it seems like an important distinction.
Well,
because
yes,
if it were up to
detail-
Our Lady alone,
You're right.
the whole world would be converted instantly.
Of course.
But
And that's-
she needs our...
Yes, as to the detail of the rings being black or thing, I would be interested. I have to study that a little further and try to get to an original source, like what Catherine Labray saw. And I think what you're alluding to, another way of rephrasing it, I would definitely say that a very basic theological principle of the faith is you cannot receive what you're not ready to receive, what you don't want to receive. And so it's true that God wants to give us all this grace. It's not God who's getting stuck, and therefore it's not Our Lady who's getting stuck, but they can only give, you can only receive what you're ready to receive. And so when we don't pray and we don't open ourselves up to receive those things, then yes, we can't receive them. So yes, I think you're completely correct. One should not think that Our Lady is just like stingily withholding these things and doesn't want to give them. No, not that at all. She desperately wants to give them to us. It's just that we won't receive them and we won't ask for them. And so she's kind of stuck. She wants to give you this gift, but you're saying no. Or by the fact that you're not praying, you're not opening yourself up to receive these gifts. Right. But thank you for that distinction. That is an important distinction to make. We don't want anyone to get like a confused understanding.
God made you without you, but he won't save you without you? Okay.
Similar to that as well.
The only other thing I wanted to ask about was, you mentioned we're in disobedience if we don't follow these commands that Our Lady gave at Fatima, knowing that the church has authenticated them. And that our salvation depends on that. So I think there's a sense in which that's very right, but it concerns me a bit because to state it in that way, just because Our Lady asked us to do these things, but she is not the Pope, right? She can't command that we make the 5 first Saturdays, right? And the Pope could, if he wanted to, right? He could make it like a precept of the church that we do that. So I think, does a lot of people's salvation depend on listening to Our Lady and do as she asked? Absolutely. She said many souls are going to hell because they have nobody to pray for them. But she didn't say you're going to hell if you don't do the 5 first Saturdays.
You're correct. You're completely correct. So I would sort of modify maybe what I said to give thank you for asking for the clarification. How I would say it is, it's like with a sin. In order for something to be a sin, you have to know it's wrong and then willfully choose it. Okay? So, and the moral sin has to have grave matter. That's basic because sin is in the will. So there could be some, as heinous as abortion is, for example, okay? Abortion is a horrible sin. It is objectively always wrong. You never murder an innocent child. You just don't. Our world is so warped, though, and so crazy that it is possible for people to be out there who don't realize this is wrong. This is how bad the lie is. And there may be such powerful pressures on a young girl, for example, from her family, from a young man, all kinds of things, that she might think the abortion is her only option, right? She doesn't even necessarily want to do it, but she does it. She doesn't think it's wrong. Maybe she thinks it's going to help. Objectively, it's completely wrong. Was it a mortal sin for her? We cannot judge that. And that's up for God. Does she really know it's wrong, and is she willfully choosing it? I don't know. That's why we leave all that to the confessional, okay? But like if you were to ask me and you knew me, and I know what I know, and I've just given you this testimony that I know how wrong abortion is, I cannot now go and start encouraging a young girl to have an abortion. It would definitely be a mortal sin for me because I know how wrong it is, right? You get that, right? So, but it's because I'm so convinced of it, because I know God is telling me abortion's wrong. So I would take the same thing here with the message of Fatima. I'm not going to tell it to everyone this way because not everyone understands this. We've already talked about how no one knows the message of Fatima. So I'm not going to tell each and every Catholic, you're being disobedient to Our Lady because you're not doing this. I can't say that. I'm not in the place to judge that. I don't know what they know about the message of Fatima. Even if they know the message of Fatima, as you all do, maybe you don't really believe it yet. I don't know. That is going to be up to you and God and how you answer. Now, I would say for myself, I'm convinced of this. And by God's grace, I'd like to say I'm willing to die for it. But that's, I have to pray for God's grace because you can't do that. So for me to not be doing this, it's very wrong. It's disobedience to her. Now, what level? I'm not going to say I wouldn't even say it's morally sinful. I would leave that for the sake of the confessional. If I miss a rosary on one day, I do take it to my next confession. I'm not saying everybody has to do that because they may not know that. They may not have been convinced by that. God may not have shown that to them yet. And so this is where we enter a much more delicate matter of the interior life of the soul, which none of us can judge. But I would tell someone, well, if you were absolutely convinced that Our Lady asked you to do this, and you don't do it, well, you tell me, what is that? Now, if the person is not convinced, if the person doesn't know, that's other things.
The key distinction, though, that has to be made on the level of whether objectively, on the objective side of that you've explained the subjective, perfectly, but is it a command or is it a request of Our Lady? If the Pope said to make the 5 first Saturday, that's a command. And just like any other precept of the church, it would be a mortal sin to deliberately disobey it, not do it, or do something opposite. But Our Lady is not the Pope. And she asked us to do these things. And we should do them, and we should spread the word and so on.
Again, it's how you understand that. I have a very interesting dilemma in my own house because, as you might know, people have different languages. They talk and say things differently. And so I got to know my wife, and my wife likes to say things like, would you like to close that window? Would you like to get me a cup of water? And for many years, as I knew my wife, I thought she was really asking me, would you like to close that window? And I'd be like, no, I don't want to close the window. Like, I like the window. And then she would get a little upset. Or would you like to get me a glass of water? And I'm like, well, no, not really. I'm kind of happy sitting here doing my own thing. I have now learned, I'm trying to teach my children this because my children have not yet figured this about mom. I'm trying to teach my children, when mom says, would you like to XYZ? She's not really saying, would you like to do it, as in she's giving you a choice. She's saying, I really want you to do this, but I'm saying it in a sweet way. All right? Right, but I'm just saying this is how my wife talks. She says something in a sweet way. She's not commanding me. I'm her husband, so she doesn't have that power. But she's asking me, and I know what she wants. And because I love her, I go and I do it. And so now whenever she says, would you like to? It doesn't matter what I like or what I want. I just do it for her, right? I think, again, maybe this is because of my own experience with my wife. I really do think when Our Lady is saying, I'm asking you to pray the rosary every day, it's this very, especially if you know why she wants you to pray the rosary every day. Especially if you know why she wants, because she knows that the salvation of the world hinges on this. So it's a very strong ask. It's a very strong ask. And if you understand this, I just say you take it to your own confessor to find out why you're not doing it and what culpability you have. I'm not going to tell you you have one culpability or not.
But if you're presenting the Fatima message as a command from God, because the church has said it's okay, then you are saying people must do this under pain of mortal sin.
No, I've never said under pain of mortal sin. That never. No. In fact,
well, that's how I understood it. If God...
but you can break a commandment and not break it under the pain of mortal sin.
Well... But you said your salvation depends on it. That's why I thought you meant it's serious sin. You're not going to make it.
I'm saying our salvation.
If you heard this message, you understand it, and you don't do it, you're going to hell.
No, I definitely didn't say that, and I don't mean to say
No, not
that.
explicitly, but that's the
Well,
implication.
I'm clarifying now that that's an erroneous interpretation of what I said.
Okay.
So I don't mean to say that.
Okay. I think it would be good
I
to
am
make
saying
that clear.
Marian, I did say very clearly, and I think this is what you're maybe confusing with the first part. I was saying Marian devotion is essential for salvation.
Absolutely.
And I wasn't saying that on my own. I was saying that on the various other saints.
Yeah.
And I am saying that if the church approves of an apparition, we have to take it as true, and we have to do what it says.
Well, I wonder if we have to take it as true. I always understood that when the church approves an apparition, they mean there's nothing in this against faith, but you do not.
But you can't
do not have to believe it. We're saying you
This is what
believe
happens
it.
with
We
Fatima.
encourage it.
People dissect the pieces apart and try to go at them one by one, which is what
Well,
Protestants
this
do in the
isn't
scriptures.
about Fatima. It's about
Right, no,
what
but I'm
is
saying when you come to
holy.
Fatima, you have to understand the miracle of the sun. You don't have a public miracle of this magnitude with any other thing that God has done outside, possibly outside maybe of the resurrection or the great miracle of the scriptures. That carries great weight. I mean, God is not just doing things just to do them. He has great purpose in what he does and has great designs. And so one has to really seriously ask, why did he perform such a great miracle? He's trying to get our attention. He's trying to make us realize Fatima is very serious and very real. So I would say that that's something that, again, has to be taken, it's part of the equation when you understand what God is working at. And maybe when we talk tomorrow about some of the other parts of this, it'll make more sense why it's so essential.
Marian Devotion or Fatima, it's...
No, definitely a message of Fatima for our times.
Yeah, absolutely. But the thing is, that doesn't get at the basic question, which is, what does the church say when they authenticate an apparition? The reason I think this is so important is because if you present it in a way that people get the wrong idea, I'm afraid that that'll turn them away from Fatima. They'll say, "Whoa, he's saying that, I must do this." If that's not what the church says, then that's going to be a problem. It's going to turn people away from Fatima, and it is absolutely essential for our times. So that's my concern.
Well, again, I'll clarify, I'm not the church. I don't have the authority to tell anyone.
But
all
what
I have
does
is
the
to
church
tell
say
you.
when they approve?
They're saying it's from God. Especially with Fatima, they're saying this was from God. This was of God. This was God's work. God did this. It was a message from
I
God.
don't think so. I think what they say is there's nothing against it.
Again, you're taking you're taking a very minimalist statement of what certain theologians, modern theologians, by the way, have said about church approval. Go read what the popes have said, literally, about Fatima. Actually read their statements and read what the bishops have said. They're saying this is of God. This is supernatural in origin. They've made those statements categorically, again, with regard to Fatima. So I'm not going to generalize and say, well,
that's the
general sense of church approval and apparition means nothing contrary to the faith. I mean, I've heard that. But there's much more. And with Fatima, definitely they've been more specific. And there's been more that has been said. Pope John Paul, don't take it from me. And again, the quotes in similar words, and I might slightly paraphrase, but I am getting at the heart of what Pope John Paul said. Pope John Paul said, the message of Fatima places an imposition upon every Catholic. Okay, these were his words. John Paul II, I believe in 1981 in Fulda, Germany, said, Fatima places an obligation on every Catholic. So that's not me saying it, that's the Pope.
That's
right. So that's what I'm trying to tell you. With Fatima, there's some very strong statements. We have to do our research, we have to know them better, and I apologize for the imperfections in my presentation. There is a lot more, and I haven't been able to get into all of it.
Is Fatima public or private? I know after St. John, nothing's public.
Again, right, that's the problem. As I said, public and private are very poor distinctions, because if you just go by definition, public is after the death of, then you sort of say no. Now,
I thought that may address the question.
Yeah, now the one thing that's very interesting about Fatima is that there's a very strong argument to be made that the message of Fatima is actually Apocalypse chapter 12 and more. When Sister Lucia was asked about the third secret, she actually said, if you want to know Fatima, just go read chapter 8 through 13 of the book of the Apocalypse. Okay? That's a very good statement by Sister Lucia, and I've actually done a presentation you can find on the internet where I try to go through chapters 8 through 13 and show how Fatima is that.
And Pope Benedict said that about The Secret also, that it's pretty much biblical.
Oh, right. So if you take that position and you say, well, basically the Fatima message is Apocalypse 8 through 13, then that actually makes it part of public revelation.
Well,
Because it's scripture.
Yes.
That's possible. And that's also very, very important to realize about Fatima. And that's what I'm saying. You take these clues from all the things, there's a lot there. Fatima is not just, it is very serious.
Yeah, and things are going to be different now because, you know, these are like the great apostasy. We see it everywhere around us. So, yeah, it's...
The convergence of events.
I fully get that. This is not like anything else. Okay? And that's why I'm so concerned that we don't, in any way, like, make people think otherwise by sounding too extreme, you know, as far as the obligation of what's going on. But
And again, I really do emphasize, though, people have to know this, and people have to believe it and have to understand it. And it takes some time. If you had talked to me 10 years ago, I didn't know this the same way that I know now, right? And God willing, I'll know it better in 10 years. And that definitely is part of it, because God is very great, very merciful, and He understands our soul very well, and He is not going to, make us culpable of a sin of which we're not really culpable, right? I mean, keep that in mind. Have trust in God. Don't trust me. I'm wrong. I'm fallible. I make a lot of mistakes. So always just trust God, but you got to also purify your intentions. You got to purify your heart. And so ultimately, when you stand in judgment, it's not with me. I'm not around. It's with God. He knows what you know in your heart. He knows how you responded to His grace. He knows what He asked of you and what you responded and what you didn't. And that's how we're all ultimately judged, and whether or not we wind up in heaven for eternity or hell for eternity. So I just say you got to purify your intentions.
It's not about my own. I mean, yeah,
I understand, I appreciate your clarification. I just want people to understand as well. I think your clarification is very, very valid, very important, and I don't want to give people the wrong impression. It's just I'm trying to say, look, I leave that completely up to God. I have no say in that. I'm nobody.
The inference is if you are going to do the first 5, she will do these precious things for you. So the flip side of that is if you don't, it doesn't mean she won't, or that you're condemned. So I think you can take
correct,
that.
Right. Also that.
It's kind of optional in that, and then you get this free if you do.
But like you say,
But there's no condemnation if you
Our
don't.
Lady comes down and says, make the first, boy.
But she-
Like my brother says, I make every Saturday. I try to make every Saturday a first Saturday, do all those things. Yeah, why would you, yeah.
We've got a question down here in front.
Thanks for the discussion. David, thank you very much. I've got 2 questions. First one was, in your experience, when do you think is a opportune time to introduce the Fatima basics to people who are newly converted, for instance, from the Easter Vigil?
Well, honestly, I'm a great believer in you don't hold back on the truth. So I would say you present it as soon as you can. I would even present it, if not that I'm in charge of RCA classes, but I would try to present it to them as they were learning about the Catholic faith, maybe even before the Easter Vigil. Now, I think the one thing, though, is, how you do present it. I think the point you've made is a very good one, and so you want to present it in the way that is most appealing and most understanding and most accepting. And that will vary on your crowd, and that will vary on the person, and that requires prudence and prayer to the Holy Ghost. So it's not that there's one straitjacket method.
Is this recorded that this could be
It is recorded, and it could be used if you think it will help and it will fall on receptive ears. You definitely don't want to turn people off. That's a good point. I take that. So I do think it's important to let them know. Now, what I think also is God is allowing, and He has allowed things to get worse, and they're going to continue to get worse. I mean, 20 years ago, I didn't think we'd be where we're at now with what's going on in the world. And it's terrible that these things are happening. But I would say that maybe a flip side of this, the silver lining, is that more people are willing to hear now. Is that more and more people I'm finding are getting to the point where they realize things are really bad. And we have no human solution. It's not like politics or economics or another war is going to solve things. things are only going to keep getting worse. And I think more and more people are realizing that. And so if they learn that the Catholic Church actually has the answer, because our Blessed Mother has already given it to us, and it's been sitting there for 100 years, we just haven't done it, and that's actually part of the problem, and everything she says is happening, then that might make them more receptive to hearing it. And I've actually had that experience. I've actually had that experience with people who convert, let's say from a Protestant group or somewhere else, to the Catholic faith, and they hear about Our Lady of Fatima, and that really helps them. They realize, oh, wow. Now they also ask the question of why isn't this being told more? Why isn't this being trumpeted from the rooftops? And I've also had the experience of someone who converted to the Catholic faith through the RCA and then went, 10 years, throw a number in there, of not hearing anything about Fatima. And then they finally did hear about Fatima. And then they were actually upset, quite upset at the people who brought them into the faith, saying, why did you never teach me about this? And that's also what you don't want. You don't want someone coming into the faith and then they go living, they think they're living this Catholic life for 15 years, and then someone else tells them about Fatima, because then they feel like I've lost all this time and I was cheated out of something that should have been given to me that's part of my Catholic patrimony. So that's why I say, I tell people all the time, in measured ways, but...
Would we be able to get your Fatima basics and present it to an evangelization team and have the team itself review what or how to present this through your Fatima.org?
Definitely the part you said. Through the Fatima.org, I'm not the final say on some of that stuff. So there's a board of directors and there are others above me. So to get their involvement, that I can't speak to. But you can certainly show them this presentation, and I can certainly come and talk to them and encourage them, and they can ask me questions, and we can have a very fruitful dialogue. I'd love for that in any group.
Okay. The second question I have is the concern about the Mass. I have had the fortune of being able to celebrate the Mass in many, many different parts of the world, and have considered it now the love language of different faith communities. But I don't understand when somebody says that they're really concerned about the celebration of the Mass. We have the liturgy of the Word, the liturgy of the Eucharist. What is the real concern there? Because I'm certainly ignorant about what the concern is.
I'm not sure what you're getting at, and this is also another subject where it's a big subject, and for concerns of scandal or leading someone where they're not ready to go yet, I don't want to say too much. I will simply say that the Mass should not be changed, because the Mass was revealed through the Holy Ghost over many centuries, and we can't deny the work God did. And someone like Pope St. Gregory the Great, who lived in the 600s, or someone like St. Vincent Ferrer or Thomas Aquinas, who lived in the 1200s and the 1300s, because the Church is universal, should be able to, hypothetically speaking, step into a time machine and appear anywhere in the Church and go to the Mass and recognize it as the Catholic Mass. However, I worry, given the limited knowledge that I have, that if St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Gregory the Great were to walk into many of our Catholic churches today, they would not recognize it as the Catholic Mass. There's so many elements that they would see that they would be kind of shocked.
And that's what I don't get. So, because I've been able to celebrate the Mass in so many different places, I don't get that, because I recognize it as the Mass, and it's beautiful. What I recognize is I don't know Chinese, or I don't know the language.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. It has nothing to do with Latin per se, and I shouldn't say nothing to do. Latin is important. But this is my own personal story, which I love, and I use it often. I have a little daughter. Well, she's 18 now. When she was a little daughter. My family actually, we started going to the Latin Mass back then, the traditional Mass. I'd rather call it just the Mass of our fathers. This is a great story. I'll never forget it. We were living in San Antonio at the time, so she's like maybe 2 or 3 years old. And I was working, and she came up to me, and she was holding her little doll that she loved. She came up and she goes, Daddy, I want to offer this little doll up to God. And I looked and said, that's really sweet, honey. That's a very wonderful sentiment. That's good. That's what we want to do. And I kind of went back to my work. And I really didn't pay attention to the way I needed to. But she was good, and that she insisted. She's like, no, Daddy, I want to offer this up to God. I want to offer up my doll. And when, it was something in her voice that really made me stop and look into her eyes and see what she was saying. And I was like, okay, this is a very good thing. Like, yes, like what are you getting at? And she goes, Daddy, I need the priest to go like this with my doll. And I was floored by that. Because I thought to myself, this child who doesn't hardly speak, she doesn't know English very well, she certainly doesn't know Latin, she still doesn't know Latin. I said, she knows the essence of the Mass. She knows what the Mass is about, and I haven't taught it to her. It's because she's gone to that Mass. She knows that you take your most precious thing that you love the most, and you give it to God, and you need the priest to do it. She only knows that because she's seen it at the Mass. And that doesn't happen in the new Mass. A child going there at 3 years old does not realize that. They're not being taught that. That's the lex orandi, lex credendi. And you don't need to know Latin for this, because it's a universal human language that God has revealed and why his Mass is a certain way. And when we change that, without wanting to, I might be more intelligent, more reasonable, whatever you want to call it, than the 3-year-old. And so I may be able to read the book and say, yes, the body of Christ is the transubstantiated host is the real body of Christ, and these things intellectually. And yet the Mass is so wonderful in that everyone who goes should know that. They talk about how if a Hindu walked into a church, would they really believe that Catholics know that this is God present, that this is God's sacrifice? And there's a difference. I'll give you another story that I love. This is a fantastic story for me. My wife grew up Protestant. She converted when she was in college. When we got married, we didn't know about the Latin Mass. And her mom, who's still very much a liberal Protestant, would come visit us, and we would take her to Mass with us. And she had no problem. She had no issues with the Mass we went to. And then we started going to the Latin Mass at one point in time. And I'll never forget it, because one time she came to visit us, and my wife was like, let's go to Mass. So she came with us like she did at other times, but it was a Latin Mass. It was the first time she'd went. We came home, and there was a 4-hour yelling discussion. She did not like that. She had a visceral, antagonistic reaction to the Mass, because she had her Protestant sensibilities. And when she saw the traditional Mass, the way it had always been celebrated for centuries, she was very upset with that. And she did not like the fact that she'd gone to this, and she had all kinds of questions and all kinds of problems. And when my wife and I saw that, we said, oh, this is what's going on. The Protestant who wants to stay Protestant, who has her Protestant beliefs, does not have a problem going to the changed, modernized Mass, and is fine there. But you take her to this, and she doesn't like it. There's something there. And again, these are not things that I see. You know, this is an example of my daughter. This is an example for my mother-in-law. And there's many more little things like this. But again, it's one of these things that until you sort of start living it and really just being sort of saturated with it, it might not make sense. And this is a slow process, and this is not, and it's really tough right now in the church because of what's going on. So I don't know if that helps at all, but.
I wondered about an answer to that for this reason. Because of the fact of being educated in Catholic schools from grade school onward, all of it makes sense. Historically, all of it makes sense. It's not divisive in my own mind. It's difference, but it's not divisive. So the fact that the Mass itself is a love language of Jesus, or of God to us, is a beautiful story, and it's a horrible story as well as a beautiful story. It's the basic call to closeness, and that's why I guess I think of people having the Mass in their own language is their love language in their families, in their communities, and now it's the love language in their Christian community. I don't see the Mass as divisive. I see some who really have a greater reverence and a greater tenderness and a greater ability to communicate that dimension of Christ as a priest leading the community. And that becomes something of preference more than affirmation of their priesthood. It's just a preference. So I'm concerned about this aspect of divisiveness rather than looking at the Mass as love languages across the world, which I think is what it's meant to be.
But it's,
I personally had a difficult time listening to the Mass in Chinese because I thought I was at a Chinese opera.
I mean, a few things I would respond is just one is you're correct. The Mass is not divisive. Sin is divisive.
The what is?
Sin. All divisions that men experience is rooted in sin. So God's not divisive, God is unity. So the Mass is not divisive. But if we did the Mass incorrectly, it wouldn't be the Mass that's divisive, it would be the incorrectness in which we do it that would be wrong. So not the Mass. The next thing I would say is remember, Christ is not divisive. And if you wish to speak of like the Mass as a love language, well, that would only be rooted in the fact that really Christ himself is the love language of God, right? The eternal Father coming forth with his one word that is nothing but love. God is love. So we know that Christ is not divisive, and Christ is nothing but love. Nothing but love. But if you reject Christ, i.e. sin, there is division. And we have the very words of Christ himself saying, I came to split father and son, mother and daughter. I came to divide. So there is this element in the fabric of human reality that there is division, that Christ does cause division. It's not Christ himself who causes that division, because Christ is truth, Christ is unity, Christ is love, Christ is God. But it is how we approach Christ and our rejection of him and our not abiding with Christ that all causes the division. And so I say it's the exact same thing with the Mass, because the Mass is Christ. It's his sacrifice. It's the most perfect expression that Christ has that he gives us is the Mass. And so the Mass will be the same. The Mass is God's love for us. It is his great mercy. It is his great sacrifice. But if we approach it incorrectly, if we do it the wrong way, and we don't accept what God himself gives us, it will become divisive. And not because of God and not because of the Mass, but because of what we humans are doing with our own sin. So I would say there's a fabulous story in Exodus that we should go back and read. If you read when Pharaoh and Moses are having their discussion back and forth and the plagues are coming. Basically, I always ask people too, what is it that Moses wants to do? And they say he wants to free the people, right? Take them to the promised land. That's actually not what Moses wants to do. We have to read scripture carefully. So hopefully you know, when God sends Moses, he doesn't send Moses to free the people. He sends Moses so that his people will worship him. That's what it's all about, worshiping God. You get the sense that if they could have worshiped God in Egypt, in slavery, that would have been okay. They just had to worship him. Now, because of sin and because of the situation in the world and all that, God also knew the only way to get them to worship him was going to be to give them their own land. So, God knows he's going to take them there, but that's not the end goal. And so he goes and the plagues come and Pharaoh relents before his heart is hardened. And the way the Egyptians worshipped, it was just the men did it. It wasn't the women. And so Pharaoh's like, okay, fine, I will let you go. But only the men. Because he knows if the men go but the women and children stay, well, the men got to come back. They're not going to leave their wives. So Pharaoh still got his hooks there. And then more plagues come because Moses says, no, it's not just our men. We got to take our women and our children too. We all got to worship God. And more plagues come. Pharaoh relents. Okay, fine, you can take your women and your children, but none of your things. Your belongings have to stay. Your cattle, your goods, all that, except, obviously, like whatever you need to worship your God with. I understand you may have to sacrifice a cow, or this or that. You can take those things, but nothing more. Thinking if I keep their possessions, they'll still have to come back. And very wonderfully, what Moses responds is, he says, no, we have to take everything. We have to take all our belongings, because ultimately when you worship God, you got to take everything. You can't hold back. And he also tells Pharaoh, we do not know how to worship God. And we do not know what God will require. God himself has to reveal it. And this is an important lesson for us to always remember with Catholic worship. We men do not know how to worship God. And we cannot worship God on our own. This is part of our fallen state. We need God to show us how to do it. And then we have to do what he says. And that's the only fitting worship for God. Every religion is false because they have tried to create their own way of worshiping God. And that's wrong. You can't do it. You have to sort of be humble and realize I am nothing. I do not know how to worship God. God has to show me. And I can't then, once he shows me, change it. Because then I introduce a human element. So it has to be God who reveals it. And that's what we had for centuries. And unfortunately, you have the testimony of men themselves who said, we're going to change this and we're going to do it better. And they created things that were not there before. And we've gotten to know that Mass, and we don't realize the history, so we don't realize it was created by men, but it was. And when you study it, you start realizing it. And that's part of what's going on here. We don't know how to worship God. We need God to reveal it, and we cannot change what he revealed. And that's part of what Our Lady was saying. Our Lady was saying, you don't change the dogmas of the faith. You don't change the sacred worship. You don't change the sacred liturgy. There is a suicide in changing it. And I think history shows it. This is the very recent history. We have changed the dogma many places. We have changed the worship. And the church is in bad shape. And the young people are leaving in droves. And every metric shows us that the church is in a kind of dying gasp right now. We have to ask why. If we were doing what God wanted us to do, then he would be showering blessings upon us and this wouldn't be happening. And it's such a great crisis in the church and such a great tragedy in the church could not be taking place if we didn't also have a great tragedy in it, the very source and summit and the heart of the church, which is Christ, which is his sacrifice, which is the Mass.
Which is the story.
That's right. David, we'll do one more question over here.
And I'm willing to stay longer if people want to talk longer, but I understand people do have to get going too, and I don't want to keep everyone. You can feel free to please get up and leave if you need to.
I guess I wanted to direct this at this young lady over here. My mother, who was born in 1912, died in 2002. Her name was Mary, and her opinion was that the new church was kind of good because you could kind of understand it, but in the old church you had the Latin on one side and English on the other side, so you could pretty much understand it. But she thought there was less reverence for the Eucharist in the new church. We had a communion rail and we had a cloth, and if the host dropped, it fell on a cloth. The priest had consecrated hands, and he's the one that gave you communion on the tongue. So the Eucharist is kind of the center of the Mass, and it's, I guess communal love is good, but, first of all, of importance would be to show our love for God and our respect for God and our devotion and piety, and some of that's been lost in the new Mass, I think, and my mother thought.
I think that you're right that a lot of people feel that way. I guess it's because one of the experiences that I thought we had Latin that had a wisdom to it was because you could go any place and you could hear the Latin. We learned the propers as a child. That kind of thing is not happening now because we don't have people who can afford to go to Catholic schools, number one. So I think the thing that I became concerned about is if the aspects of how we did it are no longer meaningful because people don't know Latin and they don't know that particular ritual, how do they be reached that this is the love of God coming to you, and how do you respond? And I think the point about not being in a state of sin and understanding what sin is was a problem here in Alaska that Archbishop Schweitz talked about and was shocked. He said, I think people have lost their understanding of sin. And from what I'm hearing you say, David, you may be encountering that just in your presentation. And that was more to the point than the ritual. Not either or, but the aspect of reform and change was to address more fully this loving God wanting to come into our whole being and affect our whole life, that I thought came across with the changes in a different way. if it's created irreverence for the Mass, if it's created an untaught generation of how do you be reverent in this situation in which you're worshiping God. That could be something, again, that's not taught. How do you be reverent? How do you go to confession? Those are aspects of ritual that I think are part of spiritual formation. But I don't know how to address exactly.
Well, I agree. I think people feel better now than they did, but Rene Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. He didn't say, I feel, therefore I am. So maybe they were more realistic at the time, and maybe the Catholics were walking the walk, as the Protestants would say, rather than just talking the talk. They actually went through the rituals. They didn't eat meat on Friday because, well, that's what we did to respect God. And we didn't eat from the night before we received the Eucharist, and we didn't drink for an hour or something. I don't even remember what it was. And the priest kind of he had consecrated hands, and so now we have everybody throwing the Eucharist around like flapjacks. That would say, hey, there's a schizophrenia here between what we're saying and what we're doing, in my mind.
I see that.
If I can add one comment to the discussion that I think is very important, because you, Beth, have mentioned quite a bit on the focus of love. And I would say we all need to meditate greatly on really what that means.
Yeah.
Because what I think is happening is that people are grossly misunderstanding love.
Oh, yes.
Love is not about feeling good and fuzzy feelings or feeling accepted. If we want to know what love is, again, we look to God's revelation. And love is never more clearly expressed than when Christ hangs on the cross. And therefore, love is inseparable from the cross, and especially because of original sin, in this world, love is never separated from suffering. To love means to suffer. If we want to measure the depth of our love, we measure the depth of our willingness to suffer, to inconvenience ourselves.
I think there's something else though, David. I think as a Christian community, it's recognizing when someone else is suffering. Because
Certainly.
I think that is the part of Christianity that may be unlived.
You could be right.
I discovered just at Holy Family that there's one of the ministers who has such severe surgery. A friend from North Carolina had to come to help her out for 6 weeks because she's also a widow. And I said to her, my gosh, I wish we'd known that we could have helped you out in this way.
I guess the other thing, I'd bring that up. I grew up in a small community in the Midwest, way back, right after the Civil War. And, people went to church and they were there basically to pray and to celebrate the Eucharist. But outside the church, they would visit and they would talk to each other and they would help each other. My dad's father died when he was like 12 years old, at the age of 49. They had 11 kids. And everybody in the community helped. I mean, we didn't have government. I wasn't there. This was 1922. I mean, the Catholic community took care of them to a large degree. So things may have changed, possibly unrelated to the Mass. I mean, Sheila mentions also that when she's in a different community and she needs help, she's more apt to get help from the Protestant community sometimes. But I mean, that might be another issue. But I don't. So I don't think changing the Mass made us more community oriented. But maybe I'm wrong.
I think that's back to David.
Yeah, because what you said is that there's no greater love than Christ hanging on the cross. That's exactly what the Mass is. But with all the changes, many of them not according to the mind of the church, you can't see that. And as evidence of that, I used to ask my juniors and seniors over at Lewin Christie. I taught there for 13 years. One of our local, considered the more liberal school. I would ask them, what's the difference between a communion service and a mass? And time after time, they could not tell me, because none of them were going to the Latin Mass. We didn't even have it. They did not see sacrifice. They did not see, this was so subdued that they didn't even realize that the Mass is a sacrifice. And the only reason you could have a communion service is because previously a sacrifice had taken place, the sacrifice of Christ in the Mass. So if you want love in a community and you're shutting down the vessels, the blood vessels that bring the love of Christ on the cross to the congregation so that they can't fully absorb the infinite love that is flowing out from that sacrifice, of course everything's going to be melted down.
Yeah, I'll tell you just a little story, because I think sometimes those stories tell a great deal. I have this little book. It's called The Holy Sacrifice of the Mass that we put together. It's kind of nice, because what it does is it goes to all different parts of the Mass. Picturally, it has prayers you can do at the different moments to express the parts of the Mass. But it shows the priest doing something, and then it shows what Christ was doing in his passion, kind of a parallel. So that you see that as you go through the Mass, you kind of go through the whole passion of Christ. And it was very interesting, because I have a very good friend. We were great friends in college. He's a great Catholic, loves his faith a lot. He goes to Mass every Sunday. He's got a bunch of kids. And his oldest son had made his first communion. He lives in Wisconsin. So I was traveling up there, and I got to see him. And I was like, oh, this is wonderful. You made your first Holy Communion. I've got like a little gift for you that'll help you at Mass. Like, I'm going to give you this little book to help you at Mass. And the boy who just made his first communion took it and looked at it and said, that doesn't make any sense. Like, why are you showing me pictures of what the priest does with, like, Jesus? And I kind of stood back, and I talked to Father more. I didn't want to really talk to the young man who was 7 or 8. But I realized he's just received communion. He's supposed to be prepared for Holy Communion and the Mass, and he has no concept that the Mass is supposed to be the Passion of Christ and his sacrifice. Like and I think this is what's happening with most of our children. Most of our children are receiving Holy Communion, and they're age 7 or 8, do not know that the Mass is the sacrifice of Christ presented to us, and it's his passion, and that every mystery of the passion is there. And so in this little book, that made it very clear to me. So I kind of talked to the father a little bit about it, because I also didn't want them to be offended or anything. But it really brought home to me how inadequate our certainly our preparation for our children is. But again, it's not just the inadequacy of the preparation of the children. I do think there is much in the changes and in the rite itself. It doesn't speak this anymore. It doesn't speak this anymore. It doesn't convey that to people.
Because your 3-year-old saw that.
Right.
To a great extent. Before she even could.
She couldn't really, she couldn't really speak very well. I mean, she was barely learning language. Yeah. So it wasn't a matter of language. It's a matter of, there's something much more profound.
Well, Lex Orandi. That's exactly it. That's it in a nutshell. Yeah. Where is the linen? Where is the dish? The reverence, if Jesus falls, no one can touch that but the priest. Kneeling. Yeah. I mean, the outward signs have to be there for the mystical infusion of the Holy Spirit, which is the church, what was infused into the church when Jesus set it up. And if it's not there, then it's not going to be here.
Mm-hmm. See, the exterior and the interior always having to match.
Exactly. Yeah, there's an absolute break in that. And it shows, as you said, look at the church now. Mm-hmm. Look at the world today. The church is supposed to receive the world, not the other way around.
Well, I think we could all go on for much more, and I certainly don't want to stop this, but I do want to at least put a break here so that Scott and I can tear down and get ready for the next day.